so that we can be sure to capture your thoughts. Awesome, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. Our agenda for this evening. So we are scheduled to be here tonight until 8 o'clock. We'll start by going through the purpose of engagement so you have an understanding of why it is we have invited you here this evening. We'll go through some meeting agreements, and then we'll get into the meat of our evening hearing from the co-chair of the Community Budget Advisory Committee with a presentation on the city budget and the work of that committee. We'll allow some time for question and answer in case you need some things clarified. During that time, we also have some city staff available here to answer your questions alongside our CBAC members. So we do have our city manager, Jamie Verbrugge, here, and our budget manager, Kari Carlson, who are part of the project team working on this. So we're glad to have them with us. And then we'll get into our public feedback time. And so that is when we would like to allow space for you to share with us and to share your reactions and your comments with the Community Budget Advisory Committee. And then we'll close and talk about next steps. So the purpose of our engagement tonight, I'll share it with you along the lines of this spectrum that we use here at the city. It's called the IAP2 spectrum of engagement. And what this shows you is through this process, when we say engagement, what does it really mean? How will your voice be used in this process? And so tonight we fall under the consult area of this spectrum. And what that means is that we're here to get your feedback and hear what you have to say about the budget scenarios. We'll also keep you informed, and so you'll hear a lot of information about what's going on from our co-chair of CBAC. And then it's also an opportunity to listen and acknowledge your concerns. And so your concerns, your comments, your questions. And for that reason, we are recording, as I mentioned, so that all members of the Budget Advisory Committee will be able to hear what you have to say, even if they're not here tonight. And then we'll also provide some feedback on how your input will be used to influence the decisions. And so we'll be hearing about some budget scenarios. Based on your input, some things may move around within those scenarios. Other ideas may be considered. In general, the structure will stay the same, and you'll hear more about that structure from Steve as we move into the evening. But ultimately, the final decisions around those scenarios will be made by the Community Budget Advisory Committee. And so they're responsible for finalizing those recommendations and sharing them with City Council. And then City Council will make the final budget decision. And so with that being said, highlighted there as well as in that process to keep the public informed, listen and acknowledge concern, and provide feedback on how that input was used. So the CBAC meetings and City Council meetings they're open to the public. You can watch them live, you can watch them after. And so there is opportunity to see how your ideas are being discussed. And I would encourage you to do that as we move into these next few weeks. CBAC does have some meetings coming up here the last few weeks of October. And then in early November is when the City Council will hear those recommendations with the scenarios that are developed that you'll hear about later tonight. We do have a set of agreements, and these are agreements that we established at the beginning of most all of our meetings, both internally and externally, especially when we're doing engagement. The first is we ask that you be respectful during our time together today. Be honest. Honesty is really important as we're listening to your input. All ideas have good intent, and so with those things in mind, we're here to hear everybody's perspective of those who decided to join us, and we're glad to have you here. And so all of our voices are important in this process, and we ask that you hold that agreement for everybody, that all ideas have good intent, even if you don't agree with an idea that's being shared. And then just have an open mind. So we're here to listen from people around the community with different backgrounds, and have an open mind as we are hearing different perspectives. Also, a couple more administrative agreements. We do have a chat box feature with the Zoom meeting. If you're not familiar, you can hover your mouse along the bottom of your screen and see a chat box pop up. You'll see a few messages from Brianna, who is here with us today monitoring that chat box. Brianna works in the finance department at the city. And so that's there for you during this time. And everything that's submitted in the chat will be saved in the notes and shared with the Community Budget Advisory Committee. That includes messages that are sent privately and that are sent to the group. So keep that in mind, everything is saved. And then it's also a space where you can submit questions. We also ask during this time that you mute your microphone when you aren't speaking, just to avoid background noise and distracting from the presentation. Sometimes you're not aware that you're making any sort of background noise. With that, we do have the ability to mute you if you're doing so maybe accidentally. And so just keep that in mind. If you're somebody who is participating using a telephone, you do have the ability to mute your phone. Depending on which device you use, you might tap on your screen and hit the mute button. I'm not entirely sure how all the phones work, but that is also available to you as a phone caller. Then I'd just like to highlight, before we get into the presentation, how to participate this evening. And so I mentioned the chat box that is available to you throughout the course of our meeting today, where you can make comments or ask questions. Once we reach the period where we're pausing for questions, we'll address those that were submitted in the chat box first, and then allow space, especially if you're a phone caller and you don't have access to that chat box, we'll allow some additional space there if needed. And then all comments will be saved and shared with CBAC. So if you choose to participate verbally or via chat, everything will be saved and shared. Both are great ways to participate. With that being said, you are welcome to unmute your microphone and participate during the feedback period. With our numbers, we've been monitoring registration over the past couple weeks. And so in order to be able to hear from everybody, we're asking that you limit your comments to 1 minute. And so that's something that I'll be monitoring during the feedback time. With that being said, I encourage you during the presentation to jot down some of your key thoughts or key things that you'd like to share to make good use of that time. And then I just put a note in there, observe the 5-second rule. So just making sure we're, allowing, with Zoom meetings, oftentimes there's a lot of blank space that maybe feels a little uncomfortable, but just letting some space sit to allow people to jump in and out of conversation would be great. So maybe you're counting to 5 in your head to think, okay, am I allowing space? And then yes, I can jump in, that sort of thing. We're glad to see such a large number of you with us, and we're just going to do our best to make sure that we're hearing from everybody. So we might experience maybe 2 people jumping in at a time or something like that, in which case we'll be mindful to make sure that everyone who's jumping in has the opportunity to share and take turns and things like that. If you're somebody who maybe you think of things after the fact or like to reflect, we will provide some contact information at the end here. So you're welcome to share additional thoughts via email. Maybe you write a letter, maybe you make a phone call, but we'll be collecting comments from the public over the next few weeks. So there's plenty of opportunity to share whether you're able to contribute today or not, or if you think of something after the fact. We do encourage all comments. And then there's also a survey at blm.mn/let's talk. And that survey reflects a lot of what we'll be asking here today. So it's another great way to be able to provide input. Maybe you're more comfortable filling it out that way and typing your responses than jumping in a meeting like this. So that space is available to you as well. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Steve Peterson, who is the co-chair of the Community Budget Advisory Committee, and he's going to kick us off with the budget presentation.
Thanks, Emily. And it's good to see folks turning out here. When we did our first round of community conversations about the budget situation, we didn't have a lot of participation from the public. And the committee really wanted to make sure that we had a good, solid representation to get feedback on our process here. And it's good to see, I'm looking down and I see there's 46 people in the call right now, which is really great. Again, my name is Steve Peterson, and I'm one of the 2 volunteer co-chairs of the Community Budget Advisory Committee. And for those of you who are not aware of the Community Budget Advisory Committee, actually, Emily, you can advance to the next slide here. I'll talk a little bit about the purpose of it, and obviously we're engaging because we've got a budget issue. But the Community Budget Advisory Committee was created by the City Council to give them advice on what they ought to do about the budget situation that I'll describe in more detail in a little bit. It's composed of 9 volunteers from the community. We have a wide variety of people on the committee. Both former Mayor Neil Peterson and I are former elected officials. We have current elected official John Gibbs, who is on the Three Rivers Park Board. We have a former police chief, John Locks, who's on there. And we have a bunch of other people who have been involved in the community in one way or another. And the goal of the committee really is to get input and to craft a couple proposals for the city council to select from for the budget for this year. And so from this meeting, we're going to use the feedback that you give us to help craft the final set of proposals. 2 ways I think that the feedback's going to get taken in. One is you may have ideas tonight that we haven't thought about or we haven't considered. And if you give us those ideas, we're going to put them down, and as a committee, we're going to talk about them and decide if we want to put them on the list, and if we do, where they would be ranked on the list. We'll also use your feedback about things that we've already talked about that we've considered, and we'll talk about those a little bit more tonight. There's tons of detail on the website if you want to go read in detail what the things are that we considered. We considered over 90 different options for the different ways of dealing with the budget issue. And so what you can expect after the conversation today is we'll consider all the input that you have carefully and use it as part of making the final set of decisions that we have. So to talk just a little bit about kind of where we're at here in the process, we spent the better part of the summer and the early fall getting data about the city budget, and then collecting ideas on what ought to be done related to the city budget issue. And we'll talk later tonight about the set of items that we've selected. But first, I want to walk through a little bit about the situation that leads us to have to make some of these difficult decisions. And if you could go on to the next slide, that'd be great. So in a nutshell, Bloomington's city budget makes a decent amount of use of taxes that are related to the hospitality industry, particularly lodging, which is hotels, and admissions, which is things like Camp Snoopy, water parks, sea life. If you look at the slide that I have up now, last year that generated about $10 million. And next year, we're expecting that to be about half that. So we're expecting to get about $5 million, $5.4 million in lodging taxes. And these taxes, combined with property taxes, fund many city services. If we were going to keep our service level the same and not have the lodging and admissions taxes, property taxes would be about $10 million higher. So for all of the last many years, these admissions taxes and lodging taxes have been helping to hold property taxes down in the city. And with the pandemic, that's not happening right now. And that's the situation that we've got to figure out how to fix. So let's move on to the next slide. And so this slide shows you which city services are the city services that have property tax and hospitality tax support. It's important to note that not every service that you think of as coming from the city receives support from property taxes and hospitality taxes. And a really good example to think about is the water and sewer services that the city provides. Those services are provided entirely on a fee basis. Very little or no property taxes go into supporting those. And so that's a good example of something that when we're thinking about the impact of the changes in the hospitality tax, that water rates, for example, are not something that's going to be in scope. And I'll talk more about that later. Next slide, please. So when the
I've not
first started
yet.
meeting,
No, I've not.
if we could mute that particular person, that'd be great. So the committee received a charge from the city council, and the charge was very general. Basically, we were asked to come back this fall with a set of 3 or 4 proposals on a combination of revenues and expense changes that the city council ought to consider. And they wanted us to have a really strong community involvement program. But at the point that the charter was made, we didn't really receive any direction. There was no guidance on here are the set of changes that you should think about, and here's the set you shouldn't. The committee had, and the committee continues to have a broad control over the set of things that it considers. But we did, as a committee, set some constraints on the sorts of things that we were going to consider. So the first one is that we are thinking about this revenue reduction as kind of a new normal thing for the next few years. And we talked about wanting to have structural balance in the city budget. And what that means is that we're trying to make decisions that put the city's budget in kind of a new baseline situation and not take short-term kind of changes to the budget, but instead try to kind of do a reset and set the budget at something that's sustainable for the next couple of years. We also need to focus on where property taxes and hospitality tax revenues go, because on the revenue side of things, those are really the levers, around the property tax and around kind of what we spend it on, that we really have to use in terms of solving this problem. And then the final thing, and this is a really important thing to think about, is that we only are considering changes that the city can do on its own, and that rules out several kind of broad categories of things. So, for example, if a change requires going to the legislature to get approval for something, we can't consider that as a fix for what we're doing for next year. It's just legislature, it's too unpredictable. We can't guarantee that we can get something like that done, and so that's out of scope. There are also things that require negotiations with other parties, and we talked about several ideas, for example, that required negotiations with the counties. That might require negotiations with neighboring cities, or might require complicated labor negotiations to occur. And those things were not able to be delivered in the time frame of the schedule, were not able to be in scope for this. So we really took a strong line on only considering things that we could actually put into effect. If you can move on to the next slide then. So one of the areas that we did take a look at is sources of revenue besides taxes. And there's two broad categories that I want to talk about. One is around fees. And the City Council was specific when we presented at their meeting in August that the committee ought to take a close look at fees to see if there were opportunities to raise fees and generate more revenue. Most of the fees that the city has for services that are kind of recreation oriented are set to marketplace prices. So an example is like golf, rounds of golf at the 2 golf courses. And those we looked at, and there were some places where there were some modest increases that could be made, but in general, there wasn't a lot of money to be generated by creating additional fees. Other fees like building permits are a good example, which are regulatory fees. Under state law, we're required to only charge the actual cost of service. And the city is pretty diligent about studying the cost of those services and making sure that they're charged out properly. Wasn't really a lot of revenue available there. We do have one new fee that's in the proposal that in terms of a major fee, and that's we're proposing a new fee to youth athletic organizations for field use. So for example, we would be charging DAA for field use. Most other cities charge the youth athletic organizations for fields. Bloomington's one of the cities that has not historically done that. And so we've put that in as a proposal to generate some revenue for the city to help with this problem. The other area that we did look at is we did look at other funds to see if there was money that could be brought from other funds to help close the gap for 2021. And we did take 1.3, and I'm noticing a typo there. We did take $1.3 million out of savings in these other funds to help with the situation for next year. There's lots of money in the South Loop funds, which are the development funds related to the Mall of America. But unfortunately for those are restricted by law to use in that area. And it would require us to go to the legislature and negotiate with Mall of America to get access to that. And that just was not going to happen in the time frame that we needed to make a decision about the budget. So those are not in scope either. If you could go on to the next slide then. So let's talk a little bit about staff, because the largest cost that the city has is people-related costs. Just a couple of things that are outside of what the committee has done that the city management has been doing on their own. They have been targeting a 0% cost of living increase in wages for 2021. So far, they have successfully negotiated that with one union. The other 4 unions that represent employees at the city and the non-union employees, that has yet to be settled. But that's something that the city management is actively working on getting that set. We did have quite a bit of conversations about pay reductions, and we came to the conclusion that pay reductions were difficult for the committee to put in place. The folks who work in business came and told us that the This can work in smaller organizations where most workers have similar jobs, but the city is really the opposite of that. We have a really wide variety of job positions with different marketplace demand for workers in those areas. Another factor is our situation related to hospitality revenues is somewhat unique in the metro area, and other cities are giving raises this year, and that puts competitive pressures on us for good employees. And the effect of the pandemic on wages really is varying widely based on the specialty of the employee, which makes making a one-size-fits-all pay reduction difficult. We have asked the staff to look carefully at pay on a per specialty level, but there's not a significant set of savings that can be generated by this as part of the budget. And so our cost reduction efforts have been focused primarily on reducing staff by eliminating programs, rather than looking kind of position by position at the large number of positions that the city has. And so that's really what we've ended up focusing on. So if you could move on to the next slide. What we ended up doing is we ended up coming up with 3 scenarios that all 3 of them have a worst case hospitality tax revenue scenario built into them. And they have 3 different changes to the city's property tax levy. So we proposed, we're about to propose a 5% levy increase as one option, a 3% levy increase as a second option, and a 0% levy increase as the third option. And just so that to kind of square that up in terms of what that means for someone kind of writing a check for their taxes, on a median valued home in the city, that's a $3.40 per month increase at the 5% level. It's about a $1.50 increase per month at the 3% level, and it's actually a $1.30 decrease if we go with the 0% levy for the median valued home. For apartments, in Minnesota, the tax system generally charges apartments more on a kind of dollar value basis than an equivalent home would take. So at the 5% levy increase, apartment dwellers would pay about $4.35 more a month for taxes. And obviously those are charged to the landlord, who then passes that through as part of the rent. For a 3% levy increase at about $3.14 a month, and for a 0% levy increase, that would be a reduction for apartment dwellers of about $1.35. So I'm going to move on next and start talking about the preliminary recommendations. And so if you could move one more slide ahead. So where did we get the information that we used to make this set of preliminary recommendations? We gathered information at over 30 hours worth of meetings. And if you're really interested in seeing what happened, all of those meetings were videotaped and they're available on our YouTube channel. We had 2 of these large scale community sessions, listening sessions, plus a bunch of smaller scale listening sessions as well. People on the committee got phone calls. I know I got phone calls from people who wanted to talk to me about the committee. I know other folks on the committee also received those. Received emails and letters. We got input from the staff on what make the most sense for the from their perspective. And for committee members like me and former Mayor Peterson and the former police chief, who had really strong knowledge of the city, we also used their kind of knowledge of the city as well. So if we move on to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the people impacts of the reductions and eliminations that we're proposing as part of each of these scenarios. So in this table that you see here, you can see that there's a 5%, a 3%, and a 0% scenario. And the 2020 actual, this shows the actual reductions in positions that this city management took as part of the response this year. So we're currently down about 18 actual positions in terms of filled positions versus where things stood prior to the pandemic. So in the 5% scenario, we continue to hold those 18 positions unfilled. And we're proposing changes that reduce that by about another 1 1/8 of a position. So for a little bit over 19 open positions. At the 3% scenario, that number of eliminated positions increases to about 24.5 positions. And at the 0% scenario, that goes up to 31.5 positions. So if we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to kind of get to the part of the presentation where if you're like me and need readers, you're going to want to get out the readers to look at the screen because we're going to kind of be getting into some detail that it's hard to get up on the screen. I'm going to show you 3 slides that look like this. Each slide contains data about a particular scenario. And so we're going to start out here with the 5% levy increase scenario. What I want to point out in the slide here that's important for you to note is that each department the departments in the city have a pretty widely varying budget. So if you look over on the table on the left here on the screen, you'll see the departments that we're ending up talking about tonight. You see the police department has a $28 million budget and the public works department has a $14 million budget. And those 2 budgets combined together represent almost half of the total budget that we're aiming for. And then all the other departments represent the other half. And so if you look on the table on the right here, there's a set of changes that we're talking about in the 5% scenario that include closing the motor vehicle office, some fee increases on golf and on ice rental, reductions in ice rinks, lifeguard changes, elimination of cultural arts grants, reducing services at Creekside, some reduction in public health services. And then we took all travel that was related to city operations and included that in the 5% scenario. And I do want to mention that that includes, even though if you look at the detailed table on the website, that it doesn't include admin. The admin travel was actually cut as part of the baseline budget. So there was no travel to cut at the point that we came along there. So if you want to look at the impact of the result of this, the result of that was about a 21% reduction in the admin department, a 12% reduction in the admin department, 5% reduction in the legal department, 6% in finance, 4.6 in parks and rec, and so on. And this really reflected that the values of the committee, which if you'll note here that there's no reduction at this level in the fire and police, and that's because we thought that kind of holding them harmless as long as we could was really important. And so you saw that value coming forward in the prioritization that the committee members had. So in that 5% levy set of columns in the table, the reduction column there shows the dollar amount of the reduction for that department. The percentage of reduction shows what proportion of all of the reductions that this department took. So in this particular case, the admin department is 21.6% of the total amount of reductions. And then the column on the right is the percentage of their budget that the reduction represents. So a $348,000 reduction is almost a 13% reduction in the admin department. So that's the set of changes that we're talking about at the 5% levy scenario. I want to move on next then to the 3% levy scenario. This includes all of the items in the 5% scenario and adds the following things on. It has additional fee increases at Dwan, and it has the new charge for youth athletic field use for the nonprofit athletic organizations. It leaves a park maintenance position unfilled, leaves a fire maintenance position unfilled. It leaves a dispatch supervisor in the police department unfilled. We would end up laying off a position in the community development department, a permit tech position. We would keep the director of that department, that position unfilled next year. We would have no staff presence at Butch Lake Beach next year. We would eliminate almost all of the sidewalk plowing and eliminate the neighborhood traffic calming program. We reduce the art center hours, and there's other staff reductions that would be included in this as well. And so if you look at this scenario and you look at the percentage of budget, you'll notice that some of the burden of the reductions at this level start to fall on the police department. But at this level, it's 0.4% of the police department budget. And in the fire department, it's a 2.3% reduction, which is related to that maintenance position. So if you advance to the next slide, Emily, this is the 0% scenario. So things that would be cut at this level is everything in the 5% and the 3% scenarios. Then there's quite a few police department positions that you see listed here. I'm not going to name all of them, but we have several positions reduced in the police department, and we eliminate pay that we use to cause the patrol officers' time to overlap at shift change times. We have fee increases for ice rental at the ice garden at the pool. We move all of the remaining senior programs to the Art Center and close Creekside. We eliminate the Galaxy Youth Center funding. We eliminate we eliminate the artistry grant, which is a special grant that the city council has had, and then we eliminate a police records position, and then there are other staffing changes that are added on top of this. So if you look at this, at the results of the 0% scenario, we continue to have the admin department having its budget cut by 12.9%. Finance cut by 6.2%, Parks and Rec receiving a 14.5% reduction. And some of the smallest reductions are in the fire department and the police department in terms of their budgets. So at this point in time, we're going to open it up to folks with questions and answers. And if, one of the things I want to encourage people to do is if you have ideas for areas that we ought to be considering, the services that the city does that we ought to be considering cutting that are funded by the general fund, in other words, ones that are funded by property taxes, we want to have those ideas so that we can talk about them. And we'll be gathering those on the recording and collecting them up and reporting them back to the committee at our meeting next week. So with that, I'll open it up to Q&A.
Could I ask a question? I'm not sure if I have to do something else first, or can I just start?
Just go right ahead.
Okay, sorry, this is my first time with my new webcam.
Yeah.
So still figuring things out. So when you mentioned the lodging admission taxes of 10.4 million, is that the total amount collected on those, or is that the 2% of the lodging tax that actually goes to the general fund?
It's the 2% that goes to the general fund.
Okay,
so
that already is reduced by that.
Yeah, and so just to note that a portion of the lodging tax goes to the general fund, a portion of it goes to the South Loop Development Fund, and a portion of it goes to the Convention and Visitors.
Exactly.
Yep.
Okay, so you weren't looking at the total, but already what's just going to the general fund.
Yeah. We're just kind of laser focused on our particular problem here at the city, as opposed to those other places where the money goes.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I'd like to ask a question. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
My question, actually, I have two comments. One of them is I'm very concerned about making those significant cuts to our police department, which is probably the best in the state, considering the fact that crime is going up in Bloomington. Every day we hear about more things, and I think it's very short-sighted to make that huge cut, even though I know that that's where a lot of our costs go.
If I could just pause and ask if you have a question to pose. We'll have some time for comment once we get to your questions, and that's where we'll hear some of those things.
My question is, do the citizens of Bloomington believe that your recommendations will be listened to by the city council? We have several examples where they have not listened to the Charter Commission, the Planning Commission. And so I'm concerned that you've done all this work and the committee might not be heard. So
I have the same concern because I've put, and the other committee members have put 50 or 60 hours into this process at this point. But we have no way of controlling that. We're trying to do our best to make this reflect the input of the community, and we're going to take it to them, and then it's going to be up to the city council to make a decision. Other questions? And just to the point, I think what I'd like to try to do again is to answer questions about the presentation that I just went through, and we'll go to the feedback part of the meeting.
I have a couple questions. One is, for point of reference, how does the 86 million compare with spending projected for this year and or spending the prior year if you don't have data for what expected spending is this year.
I'm trying to understand your question.
Well,
Yeah.
the budget is 86.4 million that you're trying to recover losses of revenue. How does that compare with current spending for an annual basis? Because historically, Bloomington has been increasing spending greater than inflation for several years. And so, and a lot of times we have not spent our budgeted amount. We have more than 5% of our budget goes unspent many years. So I'm trying to get a perspective of how tight this is that to begin with, to really need to make these cuts in the city.
Yeah, and I think maybe I can frame that up, and then it would be a good question for the staff, which is that when the staff prepared the baseline budget for this year that we were working from, how does that relate to the budget from last year? Maybe we can get an answer to that.
Well, it also have to relate to how much actual spending is, because as I said, in past years, there's been a significant difference between actual spending and budget year after year after year. And some of that margin should go away when we're facing a revenue shortfall. Wouldn't you agree?
I'd have to understand more about what you were asking in order to agree or disagree with that.
Okay, well, we set a budget, and historically we've underspent budget year after year.
Yeah, because the charter actually requires that. So I guess I'm trying to understand the question then.
Charter requires that we set a budget greater than what we're actually going to spend.
If there's a 2.5%, the budget has to have a 2.5% reserve in it when it's set. So the budget starts
And
out.
what is the reserve for?
It's just when the budget is set, you have to have 2.5% set aside to cover for unanticipated spending. That's been in the charter for decades.
Okay, but we've spent much less than the 2.7% year after year.
I appreciate your questions. I see that our budget manager has unmuted herself and may be able to provide some further explanation.
Yes. So what Steve was saying about the 2.5%, it's the contingency. We do have a contingency that we are required to have in the general fund for kind of cases like this pandemic, or things that are, unforeseen that will cause an issue with not getting in the revenues that we anticipate. But the direction that was given for the 2021 initial budget was to have no increases in the budget request, and wherever possible, departments had to look line item by line item and decrease wherever possible. So that's how the initial request came in. And then because of the significant lodging and admission tax revenues that we are projecting, then that's why the committee is looking at having to have further reductions than that. So we are not putting in, additional increases for the 2020.
So you're saying the 2020 budget is no more than 86,455,000?
Right. It's so the initial request that's going in is pretty much flat.
What was last year's budget?
So the numbers that Steve is showing is also showing some of our one of our internal service funds. I'll let some other people answer, and I'm going to pull up the exact numbers of the budget because I don't have it memorized. But
Thank you very much.
I'll come back, or I'll put it in the chat so I can let other people ask questions. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
With the 5% levy, it was $3.40 per month on a median value home.
Yeah.
what would the levy have been to have had no cuts at all in services? Point of comparison.
That's a good question. I think that, and Kari, maybe you can help me with this, but the 5% number represented about $1 million in cuts from the baseline budget. Isn't that right? So I think if I remember right from the preliminary levy conversation, it took about a 6.5% levy increase in order to have the budget kind of stay at zero change. Does that answer your question?
It would be kind of closer to probably over 7%,
Okay.
and look like more like a $6 per month increase to the median value home, around that.
Okay. Did that answer?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Every year when I'm paying attention, there'll be something from the city saying, your taxes will cost $5.20 a month. And I think, wow, that's great. It's only going up that much. What I forget is we have the county, we have the school district, we have, I don't know, the Three Rivers Parks, and we have all of these other things. And I know it's not just your responsibility, but it's not as easy as saying this. So how do you address that?
Well, we did go and ask some questions of the county and the school district, get a sense of where they're at. And Kari, I'm wondering if you could comment on the effect on the median valued home of what the school district and the county are planning.
Sure. So the Hennepin County, their preliminary tax levy is 0%. So they are not going to increase their tax levy for 21. And then the school board's preliminary tax levy is 2.8%. So with our assessing department, put all of that information together. And actually for the median home value, because of how relative values have changed with residential and commercial and how they will be used for the 2021 tax, at a 5% increase for the city's tax levy, it overall would be a reduction to the median value home, just based on Hennepin County being at 0%.
Yeah, so we didn't, when we made our recommendations and we set the 5%, 3% and 0% numbers, we hadn't yet gotten data from the county and the school district on what their intent was. So because of the way everybody is making these decisions at the same time, and we didn't have that data, but that's information that we've gotten since that point in time occurred. Did that answer your question?
Yes, partially, but I believe the school district we have some additional things that we have voted on that extend, for a few years. A couple of years ago was security, and then there's been IT and that. I don't know if those are still in place, but
I think they're flat. I don't think they change year over year. So
right, but I'm wondering, Carrie, if the amount the percentage you cited for the school board includes those extra ones, or is there an additional?
I don't know about
percentage?
anything extra. I just know about the 2.8% for their portion, but we can look into that further. And I do see someone in the chat that asked about when we're talking about the median value home, what are we talking about? So I just wanted to say, so the median value home would be if you took all of the home values in Bloomington and picked the one that's right in the middle. So not an average of them all, but if you took all of the values, that's what the median value home would be.
okay.
And what is that?
I just want to acknowledge that there's some questions in the chat asking for further detail about some of the reductions that are considered. And so Brianna posted a link in the chat, and it's also available online on the CVAC webpage. And it has the budget reduction worksheet for every single reduction that's being considered. And so if you're interested in details, You can find them there, but I don't want to spend time going through each of them at this meeting because I think it's important to hear your reactions and your comments.
Yeah, so I'll call for other questions here before we go on to the
Yeah,
comment.
hopefully a quick one that's just
Sure.
about the traffic calming program.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Like for 1 year, we're not going to make 3-lane roads, or what does that mean?
So the city's for quite a while has operated a neighborhood traffic calming program that's about measures that get taken in neighborhoods to kind of reduce the impact of traffic. So it would be like on neighborhood streets. It wouldn't be like 4 to 3 conversions on major roads or things like that. It's more focused on neighborhoods, is my understanding.
And posting those things that you're going so fast, or the cameras, that type of stuff.
Those I think are funded out of the police department, but it's more like if you had like a narrowing of a road, or if you had a roundabout that was put in a neighborhood in order to slow traffic down in the neighborhood. It's really things more focused on that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Other questions?
So I'm just going to jump in and say, let's take one more question. And I want to recognize that there are some in the chat that we hope to be able to follow up on. But let's do one more question and then we'll transition into comment to allow enough time.
Steve, are you projecting your top line revenue numbers on future assessed values? I think that's the common theme here. The current median value is just posted in the chat. Are you using what we expect to see the median value be next year, or current year assessed values in this?
Right now we're using the current year one. We don't really have final data for next year because next year's assessment won't be done until January 1st. So, you know, when we made the decision around the structure of the 3 levels, we were only like about 55 or 60% through the sales year for property in the city, and so it's hard to bring that data in a really strong way and be accurate about it. We do know that values in the city are going up this year. There's no question for residential that we're going to see a value increase in residential. But we don't know the answer to that question. So that's the last question that we're going to take. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it back to Emily, who is going to walk us through the public feedback part. And I'm going to stick around and listen. I know there's other people who are members of the committee who are listening tonight, and the staff is going to take down every single comment that folks have, and those will get circulated to the committee, and they'll also be posted on our website. And this is exactly the kind of point that we're wanting to hear what people's feedback is, so that we can make good decisions that represent as many folks in the community as we possibly can. So I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback, and thanks so far for some great questions.
All right, thank you, Steve. So again, I just want to acknowledge that not every question was answered in the chat, and that's just due to time constraints. So we're going to do our best to make sure that we provide those answers. We have some frequently asked questions available online as well that may be able to address some of the things that you were asking. But I'd like to get us into this public feedback time together. And just as a reminder, we're asking that you limit your comments to 1 minute, just so that we can hear from everybody who would like to contribute verbally. However, you do have the option to contribute in the chat, and you can type and submit those comments at any time between now and the end of our meeting. We will save those. Our agreements are also listed up here, so just be respectful, be honest, assume good intent, and have an open mind during this time. A suggestion for framing your thoughts are, let us know which budget scenario you prefer. So Steve ran through the 3 options that are currently being formed, which is a 5% tax levy increase, a 3% tax levy increase, or a 0% tax levy increase. And then share what it is about that scenario that makes it the best option in your perspective. So I'm just going to give about a minute for you to think about that, and then I'll open space. During that time, I'm going to open a poll. This is an anonymous poll, and it asks demographic questions. So the purpose here is for us to be able to have a sense of who came out tonight, so who from the community is represented, so that we have that information to share alongside your comments. And so you'll see questions about your zip code, your race or ethnicity, your age, housing status. All of your responses are completely anonymous. And I'll leave the poll open for about a minute here. If you're a phone caller, you don't have the opportunity to contribute to this poll. So just keep that in mind. But at this time, that is available to you. So while you're filling that out, I'll go ahead and open the space for whoever would like to be the brave person to share verbally first. So I have a timer in front of me.
I'll be brave.
Oh,
This
we
is
have a
Pam.
brave person. Wonderful. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start the timer here. And if you want to share your name and your comments,
Sure.
now's the
My
time.
name is Pamela Palmer. 5%, it worries me a bit, but it worries me when I see cultural arts funding that already in that scenario, it says eliminate or reduce funding. Very concerned about reduction. We all know we have to make cuts, but I'd hate to think at the 5% that you might actually eliminate cultural arts funding. So that's my 2 cents.
All right. Well, thank you, Pam. Appreciate your comments and thank you for being the first.
My name is Mary Slindy, and my comment is that many of us experienced 13 to 23% increase in our taxes last year. If you add another 5%, many of them will be 20 to 25% increase over the last 2 years. I think it's interesting that last year, when we were not in a pandemic, we had a 13 to 23% increase in our property taxes. And this year, you're only asking for 5. My concern is that that's a lot of extra tax for people who are living on a fixed income. So I hope that the committee will consider that, maybe a 3%. And then again, I am very opposed to making huge cuts in the police department at a time when crime is going up in this community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate it. So just as a reminder, I won't be calling on anyone. So feel free to jump in, and I'm going to close the poll in about 30 seconds. So if you haven't had a chance.
Can I go?
Great. Who was that?
This is Eric. I think I won with the 5-second rule, right?
Oh, there I see you. I'm like, where is Eric on my screen? Awesome.
So my name is Eric, and I want to say, first of all, thank you to Steve on the budget committee and everybody involved, because this is actually, it's been really interesting for me to watch this process. The transparency has been great. And I think, what's amazing to me when I see all the services enumerated that are on the chopping block, it's really amazing how many services that Bloomington actually provides. And so for me, the budget scenario that I prefer is the 5% increase for 2 reasons. Number one, I would prefer not to have cuts to the police department, particularly considering the new homeless shelter that's going in on Lyndale. And second of all, I think we don't know what COVID's going to do in the winter, but winters are already hard enough in Minnesota. And I feel like the only reprieve from our homes may be getting outside. And if we stop plowing the sidewalks and the parks, that's going to make it much harder for people to get outside and enjoy those nice days that we get in the winter. So I am for the 5%.
Great. Thank you, Eric. So I'm going to go ahead and just shift some slides back here. There's a request to see some more on the screen. And so if you do have any requests like that, go ahead and let me know. So we'll just start here and then allow space. I'm going to also end the poll.
Hi, Emily. This is Ann Holzman. Can I comment?
Go ahead, Ann.
Hi. I feel the same way Eric does. I just want to say I don't know when I've ever spent so much time just being in my neighborhood and going to City Hall to hang out in the art gallery. I mean, I have a ton of time on my hands right now. And my kids are at home and I need them to be able to get outdoors and exercise and do things. My daughter's still taking lessons. She takes classes at Continental Ballet, which just went back into City Hall, which has been wonderful. I'm very afraid that the arts organizations, I know a grant sounds like an okay thing to cut, but that's actually a good chunk of the budget for many of these arts organizations. I would urge the council, when it comes to that, to reconsider a wholesale cutting of that. And our kids need their parks, and yeah, I need the sidewalks plowed for sure. So I'm in favor of the 5% increase in taxes. I'd pay more than that, honestly, in order to maintain the services and the quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. That was exactly 1 minute. Well done.
I echo what Ann and Eric have already said. I'm in favor of the 5%. I don't like seeing ice rinks closing and all the outdoor activities for our youth. And I don't want to see the sidewalks not plowed, because if someone's not able to do that themselves, the cost to hire someone to do that is going to be more than $1.50 a month to take care of. And I really don't like the idea of having to close the DMV, because I have to go over and stand in line for a couple hours. It's just time I'm not getting paid. So I support the 5% increase.
Thank you, Dawn.
Steve, for a long comment. Sorry.
Also, Steve, and then Carol will go next.
Yes, I'm interested in knowing the timing of these things and when we know the assessed values and when we have to finalize the budget. And I haven't had a chance to look into the details of that yet, but I do agree that property value, assessed values are going to be increasing next year. And so a 5% increase really isn't a 5% overall increase. It's more like an 8, 9, or 10% overall increase. So we're talking about these dollars per household here. It's really a higher number when we consider those new assessed values. So I don't know that a 5% increase would be necessary to reach the budget cuts that we need with those increased assessed values. The other comment that I have is we created an environment here for the hospitality sector to do very well, and now when things turn ugly for them, it's pushed back on the residents, as have a lot of other things been. So I'm not in favor of increasing the levy to the city's residents at all. I think we need to look at other ways to generate this revenue, make up this revenue. We talked about that, and we had conversations about where we can generate revenue in other areas, instead of let's just go to the homeowners and add to their taxes.
All right, thank you, Steve. We have reached a minute. There were some questions about timeline, and if someone could plug that into the chat, some of our staff here, that would be helpful for Steve. Carol, I did see you speak as well.
Yes. Thank you. Did you say Carol?
Yes, go ahead, Carol.
Okay. I am not going to choose one scenario over another, because I think there are good ideas of cuts in all of them. And then there are some that are a little more, I'm hesitant on. I'd like to suggest two things. Sell the park that's on 101st Street. I drove by there. I'm also involved in affordable housing. I think it would be great for several mini homes that people could buy, because that has come up that people who are renting, are they going to have to rent their whole life, or can they move into home ownership? And these little mini houses that a lot of other communities around the country might be a good idea. I also am, I've had several members of my family who are police officers and friends, including some in Bloomington. And I think we're scaring ourselves too much about crime. And also, I don't think we need to be involved in Homeland Security. I also did a little survey and found out that there are so many of these specialized squads where they drive up practically in a tank. We have one, the airport has one, Edina has one, Richfield has one. I bet you if we did a survey, there would be, every community has one. How many of them do we need? Because we seem to send our police to other places too.
So Carol, we have reached the end of a minute.
Okay,
thank you for your comments. If you have anything else to add, please use the chat.
Pardon me?
Please use the chat function if you have anything else to add.
Okay.
Thank you.
I would like to talk, Emily. This is Sue Gruen, and we love the city. I was born and raised in the city, and my husband and I have been homeowners for 30 years here now. And we have personally taken a cut in our salary, and I think we need to think of the whole city at large. And I know we're not the only family that has taken a cut in pay. And with all the people in service industry within our city, I think we need to be very careful about the percent of the levy that we're thinking of. And I think police and fire department are a must. If our city is not safe, and if we don't have, I had a house fire. I love our police. And if you don't feel safe and protected, people are not going to want to live in that city. So I do not feel that the fire or the police should be on the docket to cut with any of these levies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I go?
Sure thing. Go ahead, Andrew.
All right, Andy. Yeah, so I'm definitely not in favor of cutting any police or fire. So I would tend to be in the 5% bracket. But again, as another person rated, the taxes just keep going up and up and up. So I would kind of, I just want to we just got a bloated government here. So we're pursuing the World Expo. We spent $100,000 at Valley View Park. We've got a thing called High Performance Organization that wastes city staff and time. And that was brought from Brooklyn Park over to Bloomington. It got deleted when the city manager came from Brooklyn Park over to Bloomington. So, and also we lived for a long time without a diversity director. And I hear we're going to add another diversity person on the payroll, possibly in the next council meeting. So I hope the city blocks that. So I'm in favor of 3% or, putting the police and fire on any cuts is just a no-no, but I think we can get rid of this bloated government that we got going on. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andy.
Hello.
Hi, Max.
Hi. So I think bloat is a good word for how the police are funded, not so much the fire department, but I was in the Army for 9 years, and I've seen how the government spends money on departments like the military, and they do not spend it wisely. So I would guess that there is smart cuts we can make to the police force without a loss in efficiency. And that's just from my experience in the military.
All right. Thank you, Max.
Hi, my name is Molly. I'd like to take a chance to just share my opinion. I don't necessarily have one scenario that I would prefer to select at this time. My biggest two items that I would be concerned about are cutting the police force for all the same reasons that everybody else has already stated. And also given the other thing that just hasn't been mentioned yet is all the civil unrest and how Bloomington and the neighboring cities, we've all been kind of involved in that. So it's not a good time to make a cut to the police department. I would be in favor of not making any cuts to police or fire at all, if that's possible. The other thing is that I'm looking at this from a medical background, and you guys didn't mention, somebody had asked in the questions, but the question wasn't answered about what in public health is going to be cut. I just want to remind everybody that what we're going through with this pandemic right now is also taking a significant mental health toll on everybody in the community, including the children and everybody that's, holed up at home right now. So the things that are helpful for everybody to kind of make it through that are some of our outdoors activities and those kinds of things. I know our family loves to do. So I would be in favor of keeping up the Parks and Rec department and keeping open ice rinks and opening up Bush Lake Beach.
I appreciate your comments. We have reached the end of a minute.
Okay.
So thank you. And if you'd like to add some of those specifics, I'd like to point you to the chat box. And then also just a reminder, there is a link in the chat about the specific reductions. And so you can look and see some details about the public health proposed reductions in that space. But thank you for your comments. Is there anyone who's called in via phone that would like to contribute? I know sometimes it's hard to jump in that way.
I'd like to speak up. My name is Mike Cuff, 37-year resident of Bloomington. Children raised there, went to high school there. I want to thank the committee for their work. I think it was very well thought out. I appreciate the devotion they had and the hours they spent. I believe a hybrid of the various levy proposals should be something to be looked at. I'm very much in favor of the 0% levy, and I think deeper cuts should be looked at even than that. This is not a short-term, one-year thing. We're going to be faced with a decade of the effects of this pandemic. I believe that it's going to hit harder in the second and third wave than it did in the first. And I believe we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg, and we should be prepared for even a worse scenario. Last comment, we have a lot of assets in Bloomington that could be on the sale, the chopping block, like the park that was proposed to sell that just sits there that we cut the grass and it does nothing for the city. Any assets of that type should be considered seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
I would like to thank the committee as well. I know it's a lot of work and that, but I would also wonder, you know, the how this works with the water and sewer and that, because we had a surplus this last year and we had a big rate increase this year. And I'm wondering if there's possibly some excess funds there that can be tapped to reduce expenses further in those areas to reduce cost increases. Because we had like an $800,000 surplus last year, I think. And then we had a large rate increase this year.
All right, thank you, Paul, for your comments.
Hearing no other comments, I'll take another minute. I think we certainly want to hear from our department heads on where they feel they can make cuts. We asked Chief Seal, we asked Chief Potts, can you do more with less? I would imagine that's part of the conversation, but perhaps they have ideas on ways to cut their budget and it not have to be a decision handed down upon them. They could send something back up to council. I think that's something we should consider as well.
All right, thank you, Steve. As you observed, Steve jumped in for a second time, and it appears that we do have some space for that as well. So we'll prioritize those who haven't shared. However, if there are additional comments, we do have a few minutes left here.
Emily, I have spoken before. I would just like to point out to the city that there are many little things that could be changed in terms of expenditures. I point out to everyone the roundabout that was built on 83rd and Knox. I questioned the city about the wisdom of that. It was a $10,000, they told me. expenditure when 4 stop signs would have done it. Now that's a drop in the bucket, but if we're doing those kinds of things all across the city, all those expenditures add up. And that was a very foolish build, and no one wanted it, and everybody spoke against it. So I think the city needs to look around and say, you know, what do families do when they have limited income? They pull back on their spending and they put a stop sign up instead of a roundabout in a residential area. Thank you.
All right, so just for a little extra context for everyone, if you're not watching the chat, we heard a question from a participant about whether or not we've heard from staff and executive leadership about these reductions. And so I just want to recognize a comment that was provided in response. So the options presented to the committee for consideration for budget reductions were prepared by the departments. And so staff were engaged in that process. And what was observed is that these priorities that the committee had were pretty consistent with what the department heads had shared as well. So I just want to point that out for a little context about where these line items came from. All right, so if there are any final comments, we would have time for 1 or 2 additional thoughts. So kind of last call we'll do at this time.
I can come back with answering the question about the general fund budget that was asked early on. And so, so when we're looking at the slide that you have up here with the 86.4 million, I just want to point out that the IT portion of that is not part of the general fund, but it is one of our main departments. And we were also looking at IT as a place to look for reductions because it's an internal service fund that kind of charges out to the general fund as its main kind of internal charge, and then also utility funds and other funds. So just looking at the general fund budget, the approved general fund budget for 2020 was about $79.4 million. And then what we submitted for a preliminary budget at the end of September for 21, that's we're still working on here, it was 79.5 million. It's a little bit more. And part of that is actually for our 2 police unions, the police officers and the police supervisors. They signed contracts for the union for 20 and 21, I think at the end of January. So or maybe early February, so pre-pandemic, and they do have a cost of living increase in those. So the police budget is increasing for 21, but all of the other budgets are have decreases. So I just wanted to follow up on that now that I have that in front of me.
Awesome, thank you, Kari. As you can tell, there's a lot of numbers involved in this process. So we're grateful to have your comments and patience as we work through all those numbers and sharing them with you. Did that raise any other questions or comments? We have about 5 minutes before we'll wrap up.
Emily, I've spoken earlier. There's a void. Could I speak again?
Sure, go ahead, Mike.
Mike Cuff again. An additional comment I'd like to offer. It's got a lot of baggage that comes with it, but a volunteer opportunity exists in this that I see as unbelievable. That volunteer opportunity is youth that are unemployed, retirees with time in their hands, to fill the void of any staff reductions or maintenance reductions that the city requires to keep the high quality of life that we provide. A CCC kind of opportunity exists right now that, if was started, could continue for decades. And I would think that something along that line could help support these staff cuts and yet still maintain our quality of life, our safety, in many ways. And I would hope that that would be something that could be pursued through this process. It can be done in every single one of the departments, and every one of the budgetary areas could use volunteer help, truly volunteer help. And I understand there's workman's comp issues and insurance issues, but they can be worked around. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. All right. Well, if you do have any additional comments, at this time, I'll direct you to the chat box. You're welcome to leave them there, and they will be shared with the Community Budget Advisory Committee. So I'd like to invite Steve to share some of the next steps with you.
Yeah, so we're really in the final stages of our process of creating these scenarios. So we finalized these last week. We're out talking to folks tonight and on Saturday morning, getting feedback. I also talked about how we're receiving emails and phone calls from people. You can also go participate in the community survey at blm.mn/let's talk. And then we'll have the final committee meetings coming up on October 21st, which is next Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. And then the final meeting on October 28th at 6:30 p.m. Both of those are broadcast live. If you go to the committee's website, there's a link from there to go and watch those committee meetings live. And then Neil Peterson and I will be going to the City Council in early November at one of the early council meetings to present our final report to the City Council. And that's when the City Council will begin to take up the proposals that we put forward and make a choice there. So that's really the kind of end game of the process. And I want to thank everybody for the great comments and questions today. We got some really good feedback, and I really appreciate everyone's participation. If you do have additional comments or questions, Kari Carlson, who's our budget manager, is the point of contact for the committee. Her email address is shown on the screen there. You can also get to that if you come to our website at the city. Her email address is listed there, and it's also her phone number. You can get a hold of her. And with that, I believe we are done for tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Steve. I'd also just like to thank you for your participation and for following along with the meeting agreements with us, so we could be sure to hear from you, and just for taking the time to come out tonight. Just as a reminder, you can go to blm.mn/let's talk and take a survey. and we'll be taking comments for the next few weeks. So we'd love to continue to hear from you. Any other closing remarks from staff or committee members that are with us tonight? Or a wave maybe?
Just to thank everyone for taking the time on a Thursday evening to be engaged. We appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, we have your contact information, and so we can follow up too to confirm Kari's information if you weren't able to jot it down, and some of the other links. But just as a reminder, all of this information is available at blm.mn/cbac. If you're a details person, you can find them there. If you want to spend more evenings with us, you can watch the meetings live or after the fact. But thank you for being engaged and for sharing your voice, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. It was good to see all of your faces.
Thanks, Emily.
For working with our Zoom format and all of that. And I'm going to stop the recording now, and we'll move on with our evening. Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.
Good night.